Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is Discerning What is True. I'm sharing this on Facebook and also on YouTube and also on Odyssey. I wanted to do something a little bit different. I always have had a fascination with trains as a boy. Um, I just grew up on the side of a railroad track, that is. My parents' actually, their second place they stayed in was a small home in the town of Hampton, South Carolina, and it was where a major railroad track went through. At the time, it was a railroad that went all the way to Charleston and went along back up to Augusta, Georgia. It was called the Charleston and Western Carolina. It also had a branch line in fact, his original line was originally from Beaufort all the way up to Yamasee. So I want to show you some pictures here. What I'm going to be reading is just a short piece of work here. Uh, this particular writer I wanted to share with. This is something fascinating I find. What this is you can tell that, let me just show you this here right quickly. Uh, the This is the name of the book, Logging Railroads of South Carolina. This was done by a graduate, Tom Feathers, Fetters. I picked up this book actually when I went up to Pennsylvania at the Pennsylvania Railroad Museum. I happened to see this book and I was fascinated. And I decided, hey, let's just buy this book. This would be interesting. I didn't know it would be any, I just didn't, I didn't know. I just chose to buy it. I think it was like $30 maybe. It's a hardback book. And it's strictly, I would like to show a few things, pictures of it. This was they used this, and they called it the boll weaver. So a gas operated locomotive, not a locomotive, but carrying passengers and carried the mail on the route. This would make sure that the people were served still, that is the passengers. And sorry, and they had many other locomotives here. I'm going to show you a few other ones here. They were all steam locomotives. This is a fascinating story about this railroad. It was a logging railroad in South Carolina, and eventually it goes to we call later on in the 60s. It has some diesel locomotives, so the railroad was very successful in what it was doing. And these are the pictures of the diesels here, locomotives. They were made by General Electric. So I'm going to share a little bit of the story here. I'm just going to read it to you from the book here because I think it's really fascinating because it's history to me. The name of the railroad was called, that is, at first was not even a railroad, it was Licey Brothers Lumber Company. In Miley, South Carolina, it became the site of a new and large lumber mill in 1910, built by the Licey brothers. Jacob Licey, their father, began business with a small store in Crocketville near Hampton, South Carolina. Here he trained his two boys, Fred and Henry. Fred would handle the office business, and Henry would travel in the field buying farmland, or farm goods, I should say. Henry shifted his interest to lumber and established a sawmill at Crocketville near his father's store. The Liceys logged as early as 1907. On October 18th of that year, J.C. Licey leased some logging cars from the Reputable Iron Company of Savannah, Georgia. The brothers then formed the Licey Brother Lumber Company and built a logging railroad, which ran the north along the west bank of the Salkehatchie River from Miley into Allendale County. Miley at this time was no more than residence of D.E. Miley, who sold tickets for passages and booked freight for the Hampton and Branchville Railroad and Lumber Company. Buying land from D.E. Miley, the brothers built their mill at Miley in 1910. Soon a town began to grow as the mill company hired more and more people to work the shifts. The mill was cutting, that is, 12,000 feet per day. In 1912, and the Leipzig Brothers Lumber Company Railroad had one locomotive and 5 cars. It wasn't long, however, before the company and 3 or 4 20-ton, that is 3 or 4 20-ton locomotives that operated over both the Leipzig tracks and the rails of the Hampton and Branchville Railroad and Lumber Company using trackage rights. The Leitsigs were aggressive in their business, and in 1911 added a circular saw that gave the mill the capacity of cutting 25,000 feet of lumber a day. And this was basically, this lumber was coming from cypress trees in the swamps. So this is hot, muggy work, especially in the summertime. These two saws were then replaced with a bandsaw, and the output moved to 100,000 feet per day. The Leipzig Brothers Railroad was reported to be 5 miles long in 1912, but by 1917 it grew to 15 miles long of track. The next year they purchased the entire property of the gentleman who owned the other railroad, the Malton. His name was Hampton and Branchville Railroad and Lumber, but continued to run it as a separate organization. About 1920, they abandoned the tramway they had built northward and began to concentrate on the possibility that existed in expanding the Hampton and Branchville Railroad and Lumber Company. By this time, Miley had grown to become a town of 500 people, with a general store, a steam-heated hotel, church, 6-room office, meat market, a doctor's office, and a church, and a large depot. Some 320 men were employed by the Leipzig mill to handle the volume of timber now being cut. Leipzig organized the Hampton and Branchville Railroad in September 1924 to operate the former line. They asked for permission to extend the line, and state officials agreed to let them build from Smokes to Candace on the Edisto River and then to Collegeville in the Edisto Forest. With the paper signed on October 27, 1925, the Hampton Branchville began its last major expansion and reached Collegeville the next year. Collegeville itself was not the object of the expansion. The company desperately needed to reach new timber, and the Edisto forests were uncut. The company used lightweight rail in much of this construction, and the wetlands gave much of the right-of-way the stability of a wet sponge. Several wrecks and derailments that occurred were directly related to the poor roadbed and the light rail. C. Frank Smith was at the throttle of one of the 40-ton steam engines on June 15, 1925, as he hauled a train loaded with logs back from Smokes towards Miley. It was about 5:20 p.m., and the sun was still bright and hot in the western sky before him. He pulled his red bandana out to wipe his face and then felt the rails give way. The engine lurched as Smith threw the throttle close and tried to set the engine brakes, but it was a matter of seconds he found himself trapped in the waters of the big Salkehatchie River, under the engine and some freight cars. Smith could not swim, and he began to strangle under the water as the weight of the equipment pulled him under the surface of the murky swamp waters. Suddenly, he felt the strong hands of his conductor, Steve Strickland, who ran from the rear of the train and pulled him from a certain watery grave. 2 men stood there shivering in the warm evening air as the steam from the engine rose above them. It was a moment that Smith never forgot. The Hampton Branchville Railroad purchased a small, what they called motor car. This is the one right here I showed earlier. Car in 1926 to carry passengers and mail. The M200 was a gasoline engine bus-like vehicle that offered several advantages. It could be operated by one man. In that case, that was Frank Smith's brother, He was both engineer and conductor. It could run without waiting for the loading of logs, which delayed the scheduled departure of daily mixed trains. It did not take a locomotive out of service as a regular passenger train would have done. So this was, in other words, they wanted that you could get the work done and get it done. This car was built by the company called Edwards Railway Motor Car Company of Sanford, North Carolina, and was designed for branch line passengers, mail, and express services. The H&B M200 was painted a pale green with a baggage car and a baggage compartment and a passenger section that could seat about 42 passengers. There were no tickets sold on the H&B Railroad at this time after the M200 began its service because all fares were paid in cash on board the car. One railroad passenger train continued to run for a while, with the M200 providing the remainder of the service on the line. Each day in 1934, two passenger trains ran from Hampton to Kansas, with the 10:15 a.m. train covering the 36-mile length of the railroad in 1 hour and 45 minutes. Service provided as needed to Cottesville. The company reported that it owned 2 locomotives, 4 passenger cars, and 3 freight cars, and operated over the complete 47.6-mile line. Actually, there were scores of logging cars and disconnected trucks that were owned but not reported. The company also ran a picnic excursion from Hampton to Cottesville using extra passenger cars from the Charleston and Western Carolina Railroad. Trains of 6 to 8 passenger cars plus a baggage car loaded with ice drinks and carrying a brass band were used to carry the excursions. Henry Licey died in 1932 and left the lumber company and the railroad business to his brothers Fred and Fred's sons E. Oswald and W. Norris Licey. When Fred Licey was trapped in a mill fire in 1940 and died from the burns, the two boys took the reins of the business, with Oswald managing the mill and forest operation, and Norris operating the Hampton and Branchville Railroad and other Licey's operations. Just after World War II, the Hampton and Branchville applied for permission to build to Linda and Luray on the Southern Railroad and the main line of the Seaboard Airline. State officials gave this permission, as did the Interstate Commerce Commission, but the ACL, the Atlantic Coast Line, and the C&WC, which is the Charleston and Western Carolina, appealed the decision. The H&B hoped to attain competitive freight rates by reaching the competitors' rail systems, but the ACL, Atlantic Coast Line, and its subsidiary did not sit by and watch this captive business disappear without a fight. In the ensuing arguments, the H&B came to an agreement with the C&WC and gave up its plans for the extension. W.D. Workman, a Charleston News and Courier staff writer, reported on the H&B Railroad in 1936. The company pulled out of the Boll Weaver the M200 Edward car, with E.E. Buck Bowers on the motorman, conductor on the run. Going along to explain the operations were L.D. Shake, the company's auditor general freight agent at Hampton, and secretary, that is. Workman found that in keeping with Southern custom and South Carolina law, the coach was divided in 2 departments, 2 sections, one for white passengers and the other for black passengers. Reflecting the traffic distribution, there were 9 2-passenger seats in the black section and only 6 in the white section. The passenger rate remained at 2 cents a mile. Allowed a higher rate was authorized later. The express package for the day, most of them transferred from the C&WC, included a folding roll-away bed destined for smokes, 8 large sacks of peas bound for Miley, 2 package radios, and some miscellaneous parcels of hardware. A few bags of mail, almost empty, completed the load. The small Boll Weaver pulled away from Hampton and began to trundle its way up to the line. Workman describes the trip. 4 miles out of Hampton, we paused briefly to exchange mail bags at Crocketville. Workman describes gives scant indication of once having been the principal post office of the region, that is, terminus of a weekly horseback delivery from Charleston was actually the town of Crocketville. That's where my mom was born at. She was born in a town called Crocketville. Leaving Crocketville on a rough process, we passed through fields of corn and cotton before reaching the woodlands of Whippy Swamp. That's Whippy. Much of the arable land in the vicinity had lain fallows for years, a constant reminder of the still pressing shortage of farm labor. Beyond Whippy Swamp, the tracks led on to the Lightsey Brothers sawmill at Miley, and we pulled up alongside the large commissary. The stock was longer, for there was freight to be handled and mail to be delivered to Mrs. Viola Miley, longtime postmistress and freight agent at Miley. Adjourning the sawmill are the shops where the H&B rolling stock is repaired, along with that of the Lightsey Brothers logging trains. Just outside of Miley, a non-scheduled stop was made in front of a shanty alongside the track. Engineer turned a batch of clothes over to his black washing woman. We cracked along into the Salkehatchie Swamp over a large field where once was 5,600 feet of wooden trestle built with the Malden and Son first established the line. Across the swamp, we rolled into the tiny Colleton County community of Mazzella. Here, freight shipments were made of wire poles and pulpwood, which were piled up alongside the sidetrack. As we approached Ashton, a few miles further down the line, Mr. Shelton reminiscent of days when the late B.L. Jones was in the heyday as a cotton buyer. As a buyer for the Augusta firm of Pope, P-O-P-E, and Fleming, Mr. Jones had a tremendous personal following among South Carolina farmers. Cotton was brought from miles around into Ashton, and thousands of bales were shipped annually from this small town. At Ashley, the boll weaver was obliged to pull off on a sidetrack to make way for a logging train being loaded with huge timbers. South of Lodge, our line crossed the tracks of the Atlantic coastline, that is, branch line at what is known as the H&B Junction. Up to that point, we had been in the direction of Branchville, but here we began to bear off to the east towards Little Salkehatchie Swamp. We passed momentarily through the very tip of Banbury County Little Swamp section, but we were back in Colleton County in less than a mile after leaving it. The tracks led on through farmlands and tracts of timber to the little community of Paget's and on through onto Buckhead Swamp and to Smokes. The stop at Smokes were made interesting by the rather awkward transfer of a folding bed from the coach to the express agent W.D. Warren. Beyond Smokes, a dish-heaved pile of tile bore the mute testimony of a farmer long since abandoned plans to drain a low-lying field. Mr. Shaker said that the tile was there almost 10 years nearby, was a field where drainage tile was successfully employed. Between Smokes and Candace, we passed through the northern portions of a 5,000 acre timber holdings known as the George Tract. Mr. Sheckles said that the land had been handed down from an original grant from Lord Colleton. At one time, it was given by a large landowner to a faithful slave named George. The tract is now owned by the H&B and is held as a timber reserve for bridge timbers and other lumber. The land is low and ditches along the track are filled with water most of the time. Before reaching Candace, we passed over the remains of an ancient canal dug with slave labor years ago. The canal serviced the purpose of draining some of the standing water, but was dug primarily as a means of floating logs down into the Edisto River. The huge square logs, some more than 60 feet long, were floated from the canal to the river and made into rafts for the voyagers downstream to tidewater. There were little signs of civilization through most of the George Tract. Small bands of cattle were foraging without sight of the track, and on several occasions, nimble goats scampered down the rails in front of the motor coach. Swamp-like sections gave the impressions of being good lairs for snakes and alligators. Mr. Bowers confirmed this suspicion by saying that he occasionally saw alligators along the track and once had to dismount to kill one with an axe. Emerging from the George Tract, we swung up off the spur track known to the railroad men as a Y and backed up to the little station at Candace. That, we were informed, was the end of the passenger line. Along the freight route rolled another 13 miles to Cottageville. A glance at our watches showed that the 36-mile trip from Hampton was completed in the normal time around 2 hours. After an hour wait at Candace, we boarded the boll weaver again and set out towards Hampton. In 1948, the mill was probably the biggest logging operation of all the huge mills that were in service in South Carolina. It processed 18 million board feet of lumber from 65,000 acres of land that the company controlled in Colleton and Hampton counties. The mill produced such specialty items as silks, molding, framing, flooring, sheeting, siding, paneling, card table sections, ladder rungs, crates, and other wood items. The M200 was still used through the 1940s and into the early 1950s. It broke down on November 6, 1951, and the company discovered there was no spare parts for the 27-year-old machine. The Edwards Railroad Motor Car Company was out of business too, and there was no easy way to repair the car. The company pushed the M200 into a windowless storage shed at Hampton, and it remains there to this day. Well, not anymore. It's actually at the Spencer Railroad Museum in Spencer, North Carolina. I've seen it. And they apparently have repaired it, as far as I know. Let's continue. Says passenger service was still an obligation of the company. The company hauled the mail and the few passengers in a company truck. This service remained until September 1960. And I'll show you something else here. These are the locomotives, the diesel locomotives they had also in the early 60s. Some people were permitted to ride the logging trains. Bill Cannon, who rode the H&B in 1955, recalls that the company loaded log racks and flat cars with bulkheads ends as a siding just west of Cottageville. His trip was on one of the two General Electric 44-ton diesel switchers, number 42 and 43, that treaded carefully over the light rail to Cottageville, picked up the cars and hauled them back through the swamps to Hiltus without brakes, where the big 70-ton diesel, number 70, made them in part of his train for the trip to Miley. In September 1960, the track east of HB Junction on the ACL all the way to Cottageville was abandoned. The Hampton Branchville was one of the last lines in South Carolina to turn to diesel. On the other hand, it was the only logging railroad to last so long and to have the capital to finance the change in power. Steam engines were used regularly up to 1951 when the company purchased two General Electric 44-ton switchers. Steam continued to be used on most of the main line trains until 1958 when the company added a 70-ton General Electric unit. In 1961, it became only a domestic company. Sorry, in 1961, it became the only domestic company to purchase two of General Electric export diesels, which were designed for primitive trackage in other parts of the world. These were suggested to be the best for H&B use by General Electric after General Electric examined the track condition of the line. These were the number 80 and number 81, which were the U-8B class units. The two 44-ton engines were sold in 1961 when the new General Electric export diesels arrived. The only new power since then was the purchase of a new electric motor division, that is, of an SW1000 diesel switcher that the line bought in 67. The Hampton Branchville Railroad operates to this day, the only logger to remain in operation. However, this complexity of line changed in recent years. Now is a part of a rail system that was set up to deliver unit trains of coal to a huge power plant at Candace. At Candace Station on the banks of the Edisto River, about 1 mile from the town of Candace, although the H&B served the area, the abandonment of 1960 isolated the town. The ACL built a new 9.8-mile branch line from Stokes directly to Candace to serve the new power plant, which received unit trains from Virginia Coal, the former Charleston and Western Carolina, to Hampton, the H&B and HB Junction, and the ACL to Candace, where the South Carolina Electric Gas had its own small 80-ton General Electric diesel to move the cars to and from the dumper. What was it that led the Hampton and Branchville service, where the Atlantic Coast Lumber Corporation, the Conwell Lumber Company, and the Camp Manufacturing Company all failed? It was the H&B adaptability to the changes that came late to South Carolina. The other companies saw the timber as a single source of revenue that was depleted two ways: by outcutting and by a loss of direct sales interest as the logging industry moved to the central and Pacific states as well as on the Canadian provinces. The H&B cut back in its logging line when it had to, but developed other businesses to take its place. This unique line stands for most for surviving a difficult and trying period of adjustment and proved to be too much for other loggers to withstand. So I thought I'd share that with you guys. It's not a normal serious type of deal, but I wanted to just share it because simply it's history. And this particular railroad line I took pictures of is still there. It's no longer used, and it's been actually dormant since 2014. A Charleston man has bought the line, as far as I know of, but there has been no work. There's nothing there. And what I understand, basically, is put what I call cars, excess of cars that are just sitting there uh, on the line, on the sidings, to hopefully have some type of business in the future. But what I was told yesterday is that they're in the planning stage that they're going to probably pull up the rails. So there will not be this railroad anymore. It'll be gone. So that's why I took those pictures and shared the videos yesterday, because it might be the last time I get a chance, not the last time I might get a chance, but just the last time I might get a chance to take some pictures of the railroad there, the tracks, which where I took pictures of yesterday was in a small community called Crocketville, which at one time was the major post office to the west, um, since it came out of Charleston, South Carolina. So I just thought I'd share this little short video of this railroad, logging railroad. Um, the other thing I wanted to tell people is critical about this particular railroad, logging railroad. Most railroads fail eventually. They did. They went to steam. As far as I know, this was the only railroad that actually changed over to diesel. So they were actually very efficient in what they were doing. But I wanted to also tell you something that most people are unaware of. And I've done this probably 15 years ago. I went down there. They was still doing work there. Maybe it's more than that. Maybe 20 years ago. And I went down to that area mildly and talked to someone and got a chance to talk to them and took some pictures. And what took place, he showed me. He says, "Yeah." He showed me a piece of script. And I don't know if anybody knows what script is. Script is basically what was used a lot of times in the South. Um, a lot of times, and even mills in the South, cotton mills, were using script. They would a lot of times people would live in housing that were provided for by the um, cotton mills, and they were paid in script. And they also were, since they didn't get paid in dollars, money, they had to buy their merchandise from a company store. So this really actually made them actually, in reality, a slave, you see. So, and then probably in the, he doesn't say anything about it, but what happened, um, the federal government came in and said, you're going to have to change this. You're going to start paying people in dollars. And they said, no, we're not. And they closed the business. They quit. They stopped doing that, I guess, in mid 50s. And with that, they then concentrated on making deliveries of freight, that is coal cars, all the way to Candace Corner, which was a South Carolina Electric and Gas power plant. And that ended when the coal industry, which is unfortunately, our government is actually, folks, I'm just going to be really straightforward with you. It's about the coal industry. There's tons and tons of coal here in this country, and the press is brainwashed about everybody in this country in every category. And so we have plenty of coal here. We have plenty of oil too here. But what happened simply is Obama made a pledge just after he voted. I mean, just after he got elected. This was in 2008, and he says you can build. This is the completely arrogance of a president. He said, you can build a coal power plant, but you won't be able to operate it. So what he was saying simply is that you build it and waste your money and you'll never get a chance because the government will not allow it. It's just part of Agenda 2021, you see. You got to be dependent upon other countries, you see. It's all about destroying the West. That's what it's all about. But that's what transpired. And so what's happened now, all those plants now, a lot of them are now, I think a couple still are coal power. Very few are, and it's gone away here in America. And the revenue was actually created by the railroads to moving this coal traffic. But yet we've gone back to Mr. The railroad at Burlington Northern Santa Fe. You see, they turn a blind eye, and I'm trying to remember his name. He's a rich man. He owns the railroad. There's no other railroads in this country, folks, that is owned by an individual. And I'm saying he owns the majority of the stock. The rest is stock owned. Okay. So what's transpired is simply this: he can ship the oil through tank cars, which, if you go back in history, that was done away with when we started shipping oil through pipelines. But this guy, Mr. Buffy, not Buffy, God, I know his name. Anyway, he owns the railroad. He owns also a major real estate agency. And what happened was simply is that he was allowed to do that. So we get oil, a lot of oil now from Canada, imported, and his railroad actually transports it throughout the country. Isn't that asinine? We got plenty of oil in this country, and yet we're doing this type of shit. Because, someone buys someone else off. Those fucking politicians, those both Republican and Democrats. Folks, there is no fucking difference between the two political parties. There isn't. And if you think so, you're an idiot. You really are. And you really have no idea what you're even looking into. And so, this is my feelings, but simply is the politicians who are basically lawyers have destroyed this country enormously. They've destroyed businesses over and over, except the ones that are large and allow them to do whatever they want to do. You see, and they're con men. They're foreigners. But anyway, I don't want to stay up all night either. I just wanted to share that video tonight because it just, people need to know. And this was one of the last railroads doing logging industry. Then they gradually, most of them went out west. Let's see. And the logging railroads in California, strictly was, wood. And it's just interesting to know that. So you have the Yosemite Lumber Company or Yosemite Railroad Company. I can't remember what it's called, but it's in Yosemite, California. It was just one example, which I have a book on that also. But excuse me. But I wanted to share this information with you because there were literally hundreds of logging railroads in South Carolina. And this guy, Tom Feathers, did an excellent deal on this whole thing. And these were what the locomotives looked like. The little things here. They were made by like 4 different companies. They were made by H.K. Porter. Climax was one of the locomotives. The Heister was another one. And there's one other type one I can't exactly remember. But they were built what I call really short. They were not made for, they were made for industrial type curves, as these railroads here are not what I call very, it's just a lot of curves that go through the mountains. So these companies they did this kind of work. This is and they were a Heisler railroad. Locomotives were made for that. They did that for a while, and then that naturally went out west, and the Climax, and there's another one I can't think of, and the H.K. Porter, which was even a smaller locomotive. And anyway, I just thought I'd share that with you. And this guy goes through each county of the state, actually, and basically shows where the logging was done. And there was plenty of logging to be done, wood. They cut down wood. And as far as I know, they planted more wood trees also to build to have it for the future. Something that we don't do anymore neither. Okay, I wish you a good night. You take care, and we'll talk to you later. Thank you for being here.